So let's continue this session of Spring Boot. Before we saw Spring Core concept. Now let's see Spring Boot core concept. Just a second. My emotional support graphic tablet. So yeah. Okay. So Spring Core concepts we saw. I don't know if they were necessary. Now let's start with Spring Boot core concepts, and so these are the features: architecture, sanitation, auto configuration, Spring Boot status, create a basic application, best practices, application properties, YAML file, and actuator dev tools. Let's start with the architecture. So we already saw the architecture of Spring Core, where there were layers. Then here, so first thing, Spring Boot is a framework built on this. This is all necessary. So architecture consists of presentation layer, business layer, persistence, and database layer. So presentation layer acts as a entry point to Spring Boot, also known as controller layer. It is responsible for handling all incoming HTTP requests. So all the HTTP requests will be coming to presentation layer. Handles HTTP methods such as GET, PUT, or CRUD operations. Exposes RESTful APIs using controllers. Okay, performs request validation, manage authentication, entry process, convert JSON, Java objects to JSON, forward validated request to the business layer. Okay, so whatever the requests are coming to this are forwarded to business layer. Okay, this basically contains the controller, I guess. This is also a service layer. So it's handle all those requests and expose the RESTful APIs using controllers. So using controllers means it has the controllers presentation layer. Okay. Then performs request validation and manage authentication and everything. So yeah, validation of REST controller, get mapping, post mapping, request body, path variable, everything is in here. Okay, presentation. Then coming to business layer. Business layer is also known as service layer. It contains core business logic of the application. It acts as an intermediate between presentation and persistent. Okay. Then it implements the basic rules. In service we have the implementation of the APIs, so the basic rules of that. Then processes and validates data, handles authorization and authentication using Spring Security. Okay, it provides authentication. It manages authentication entry points. It provides authentication. It manages transactions using transactional, communicates within persistent layer. Okay, the transactional service in persistent layer. Persistent layer is responsible for database interaction. It abstracts handling database operations and the rest of the application. Maps Java object to database tables using ORM frameworks. Okay, using ORM it maps with database, perform CRUD, manages database transactions, and both relational and NoSQL. Okay, technologies is Hibernate, RDBC, Spring Data JPA. So Spring Data JPA is again a principle, like a set of rules that they follow to use in ORM frameworks, right? The standards that they use. And Hibernate is the ORM tool that we use in Spring. Okay, RDBC, then repository, which we use repository, and JPA repository. So we generally extend repository layer with JPA repository and call the functions, whatever are they, find, get, delete, save, everything. So we use @entity or ID table to tell this is an entity table. Then yeah, database layer. The database layer contains the actual database where the application is stored, relation database, all this cloud. Okay. Explanation how this works. So repository layer, service, order, control. Okay, let's see how that is. The client, front end or a API consumer sends a HTTP request. Okay, so now example, there is an interface client and he sends a GET request. The request is handled by the controller layer, which maps the request to a specific handler method. So the front controller which they talk. Similarly, there is a controller layer or presentation layer that handles the request. Okay, the service layer is processes the business logic and communicates with the persistent layer. So in the service layer, the basically logic of that controller exists, and it processes that to the persistent layer, and the persistent layer interacts with the database using Spring Data API or R2BC, then through a repository class that extend CRUD services. Yeah, so in the persistent layer, we have a repository class that extends CRUD services, and basically it's a connection, the main connection with the database and this object. The process response in a JSON. Spring Boot actuator can be used for monitoring the health checks. Where is this? Okay, health checks. Monitoring health checks, this is not required. Fine. Architecture is done. Then let's go to annotations. Oh, why? I just need them in one. No. Choose right view. Okay. Spring Boot annotations, these are. I generally know Adroit component, Adroit service, Adroit controller, REST controller, which is there. Get mapping, put mapping, post mapping. And that's all right. Yeah. Let's delete mapping. Okay. What else are there? So Spring Boot, annotations in Spring Boot are metadata that provides instructions to a Spring framework at runtime or compile time instead of using complex XML configurations. Instead of the XML configuration, we use annotations. It helps in this code. Then Spring Boot application annotation. This annotation is used to mark the main class of the Spring Boot. It encapsulates Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and components can auto annotations with their default attributes. Okay, so components can previously enable auto configuration of Spring Boot application annotation. So Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration of this. It encapsulates this annotation with the default attributes. So Spring Boot application we have given a default demo application, and when Spring application run, we can give directly the class of this. Then Spring Boot configurational annotation, which was this. Okay, it indicates that a class provides application for a Spring Boot application. It indicates that class provides configuration for a Spring Boot application. It is a specialized version of configuration, and it is automatically included in the Spring Boot application. Provides class that provides, indicates a class provides or configurations for Spring Boot application. Specialized version of configuration automatically. Okay, it automatically includes this, but the class that provides configuration for this. Okay. Yeah. Enable auto configuration. Enable auto configuration enables Spring Boot's auto configuration mechanism, automatically configuring beans based on the class path dependencies and application properties. Okay. It enables auto configuration. Component annotation tells Spring where to search for the component like this. Oh, okay. Components can use to search components like these. Control service. Spring Bean annotations, these are. Oh, and the Bean annotations are component, which we saw. Generic managed components, it automatically detects that components can. Service used in service layer. Repository used in the DAO layer. DO. I heard about this. Used in the DAO layer to interact with database, automatically translate database exceptions in Spring into Spring exceptions. Okay. Configuration indicates that a class contains Spring configuration and bean definitions, acts as a replacement for CIS placement for this bean. Use it to define Spring Bean explicitly inside the configuration class. Okay, explicitly if you want to define. Gives full control over the bean life cycle and creation. And in the dependency injections, we have auto wire, qualifier, primary. Auto wire is automatically injecting elements for manual, okay, object creation. Qualifier, which beans, if there are multiple beans of the same type exist, then this one qualifier we give a name. Primary, which to use the primary, and this REST controller use it to RESTful APS that automatically turns data in. So RESTful APS for a write controller we use. Then this request mapping, okay, makes HTTP request to control this, define the base of the URL method. Okay, request mapping where it should URL path we give. HTTP methods get map, post map, put map, delete map. Okay. Then path variables. If we are passing any ID or something, use path variables. Get map using ID. This ID is dynamic and that will be path variable. Okay, request map. If you are using ready reads query parameters from the request URL, use it for options or filtering inputs. Get map, public search, request parameter. Okay. Directly from the input or filtering if you're getting. We'll take it. Fine. Request body. For post we generally use this. Binds the HTTP request body to Java object, commonly used for post input. Uses, and from the request body we get this body basically. Generally we pass object. Then value. Injects individual property values from application properties. Application.yaml. Okay. We give value equal to this, and we just give assign value default, right? Maybe that. Injects individual value from application.properties. From application.properties we are injecting. For configuration properties, binds the group of related configuration properties to a POJO, type safe. So many. Okay. Validation annotation. Not blank, not none. Oh, it shouldn't be blank, or this shouldn't be null. And email validates email format, size. Oh, then exception handlers. Handles exception, allow custom error responses for the exceptions. Controller advice provides global exception handling across the controllers, centralized error handling logic. Okay, global exception handling it is. Then JPA database entity marks a class as a JPA entity. Key specifies table mapping, ID is primary. JPA entity means then it should follow a set of rules and things. Generated value, auto generates primary key values. Okay, identifier, identity column maybe, and column map class field to column table. Class field column table. Automatically should not. Okay, this is done. Then auto configuration. Maybe after this I'll see something like how the interview questions proceed, because I don't know what exactly is important. Oh my god. So Spring Boot auto configuration is heavily attracted developers towards its three main features: auto configuration, such as checking for dependencies, the presence of certain classes and class path, the existence of bean, or the activation opinionated approach, the ability to create standalone applications. Auto configuration, conditional annotation, it automatically registers the bean with component bean. Okay, enable auto configuration. This annotation is absent as well. Why? Oh my god. You should use enable auto configuration or rotation only one time in your application. Spring Boot or jar is the file that looks after all the auto configuration for MVC and the frameworks that present in a single jar. So this jar is for the annotation. This uses this Spring Boot application and enables auto configuration for dependencies and Spring applications. Okay. Why so much auto configuration is mine focus. Our Spring needs a respective set of dependency to work. Spring Boot auto configuration. This gently creates this all the dependencies which we give, right? Auto configuration is main focus. Our Spring application needs a respective set of dependencies to work. Spring Boot auto configuration preset is dependencies without a need to configure them manually. This helps. Okay, all the dependencies that we give. Understanding auto configuration of dependencies. Why we need to understand? At this point, I will directly give now itself. Give take up 100 questions for interview of Spring Boot. Cover all concepts. If 100 means it doesn't give the explanation, so maybe first give top 10 questions question and explanation along with explanation of them. I will generate next later. Let's see. At least we'll be able to answer a few, maybe. I'll start with top 10. Okay. What is Spring Boot? How it is different from Spring Framework? What is auto configuration? Okay. What is Spring Boot status? What is the role of Spring Boot application? What are embedded servers in the Spring Boot? Okay. How does Spring Boot handle configuration? Oh yeah. What is Spring Boot actuator that is coming down? So this is important. What is the difference between these? This okay. What is Spring Boot dev tools? Okay. Okay. Let's see. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an optional framework, opinionated framework built on top of Spring that simplifies development, production ready Spring applications with minimal configuration. With minimal configuration, we built something on top of Spring. So that allows us to do auto configuration instead of always using XML or some other file to manually configure, which helps for developers, is what I think. So key differences: it requires heavy XML and Java. It is auto configuration, manual dependency. Start. Oh, that's what they were talking about here then. The starter dependency, here the manual dependency. Okay. Needs external server, and here we have embedded server strong and boilercode minimum word. Okay. What is auto configuration? Now we were seeing this auto configuration, right? Wow, it's in top 3. So auto configuration automatically configures Spring Beans based on class path dependencies, existing beans, application type. If this is present, class path dispatchers have lit. Okay. I mean, what was it? It redirects the things, right? Then Tomcat, Jackson are configured automatically. The Tomcat is embedded server. Behind the scenes, it enables auto configuration, uses Spring.Factories, condition automation. let's see. Give in detailed explanation about this with example. Alright, let's go deep. What is auto configuration? Auto configuration is Spring Boot that automatically creates and configures Spring Beans based on this. We saw what are Spring Beans, right? Annotations, we have Spring Beans annotation. Okay. Which auto configuration is Spring Boot feature that automatically creates and configures Spring Beans based on creates and configure them. Normally we create a Spring Bean on this. Okay, class path dependencies, existence bean in the application context. Okay, in the application context, what is and values of this application or properties. YAML file. The goal is convention over configuration. You write less config, Spring Boot figures out the rest. Okay, so why auto config? Problem it solves. Traditional Spring, you had to manually configure this dispatcher servlet. Once I will just okay, maybe I'll just Google itself again. I have to create a prompt. Array. Just a second. The rest front controller is okay. Request comes to this and handler map, just controller. What's the emote else? In Spring Boot dispatches a central front controller that orchestrates the entire request handler. It is a single point. All the HTTP requests coming, it will delegate. Okay. Manages the flow of web request interception, handling and everything. Unlike traditional MVC, which requires Java configuration, automatically setups. Okay, fine. Then view resolvers, data source, entity management factory, transactional manager, lot of configuration. Spring Boot approach, just add a dependency, Spring Boot starter web. Okay, right. And boom, you got Tomcat, dispatcher servlet, Jackson basically convert Java to this. Like whatever you get in a list format or object format, it converts to JSON converter basically. Default error handling are ready, everything. Core annotations behind auto configuration. Enable auto configuration. This annotation tells Spring Boot to look at the class path, decide what should be auto configured, register beans accordingly. Normally you don't use it directly because it is included in Spring Boot application. How auto configure works internally. Step 1. Spring Boot scans spring.factories. Okay, the file contains enable auto configuration, web configuration, data source. Conditional annotations decide where to apply. Each auto config is guarded by conditions. Okay, important conditions annotations, very important. Condition on class. Bean is created only if class exists in class path. Okay, dispatcher if class exists. Configure MVC only if this exists. Then bean is created only if you don't have, if you haven't defined one yourself. Condition on missing this. Meaning I will create a default data source only if you don't. Okay. Condition on property. Configuration depends on a property value. So name and having to bean created if only another bean exists. Real example. I kind of didn't get it. Data source auto configuration, application properties. Custom bean overrides auto configuration. Auto configuration backs up because this is called how to disable auto configuration. Debugging. Oh, it's already half an hour and I didn't do much. Let's see. Let me understand it better and come with something new. Okay. Bye. I mean, I'll come with this only. I'll see, understand, and try to explain what I understood.